Margaret Johnson stepped onto the sleek private jet as the afternoon sun bathed the tarmac in golden light. Dressed in a deep navy blazer and tailored slacks, she moved with quiet elegance, her soft brown curls brushing her shoulders as she nodded politely at the crew. From her calm composure, one would think she was simply another passenger heading to a business meeting or a family retreat. But inside the lead flight attendant, Karen Mitchell narrowed her eyes sharply as Margaret walked past. Karen's crisp uniform and stiff posture radiated control, and she prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged in her first-class cabin. With a tight smile, Karen greeted the older white couple behind Margaret, her voice warm and sugary. But when she turned to Margaret, her greeting vanished into silence, replaced by a look of mild irritation. She glanced at Margaret's seat assignment and forced herself not to roll her eyes. In her mind, there was no way a black woman, no matter how well-dressed, belonged among her elite passengers. Margaret simply lifted her chin slightly, her expression calm but unshakably firm. She placed her leather bag neatly under her seat and settled in, gazing out the window as the engines hummed softly. She could sense the judgment in Karen's eyes, but she had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. What Karen didn't realize, as she strutted through the aisle with arrogant certainty, was that this woman she dismissed so easily wasn't just a passenger. Margaret Johnson owned this entire plane, and very soon Karen's entire world was about to be turned upside down. Karen Mitchell moved down the aisle with practiced precision, greeting other passengers with flawless etiquette. Her white gloves brushed against seat backs as she adjusted pillows and offered champagne to the older guests, her voice dripping with polite sweetness. She paused briefly to offer an extra blanket to Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, a retired couple traveling to Scottsdale for their granddaughter's wedding. "Anything else I can get you today?" she asked them, her smile bright and genuine. Mrs. Reynolds shook her head, already absorbed in knitting a tiny pink sweater, while Mr. Reynolds simply nodded over his reading glasses, sipping his coffee with quiet contentment. But as Karen turned back toward Margaret Johnson, her demeanor shifted. The warmth drained from her expression like someone flicked off a light switch. She caught sight of Margaret's leather carry-on, neatly tucked under her seat, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't offer her a drink, nor a polite inquiry about her comfort. Instead, she breezed past without so much as a glance. Margaret watched this small but telling slight unfold, with an unreadable expression, her gaze trailing after Karen's retreating figure. She knew what this was. She had felt it 100 times before, that subtle dismissal, a social slap delivered with a silent smile. Karen's judgmental thoughts churned behind her eyes. To her, appearances mattered above all else, and Margaret didn't fit into her vision of who belonged in first class. Her tailored outfit didn't erase the color of her skin, and for Karen that was enough to define her worth. As she passed by, Karen leaned over to whisper to a junior flight attendant, Lisa Campbell, a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s, who watched the scene unfold with nervous discomfort. "Watch her closely," Karen murmured with a smirk. "People like her always think they can sneak into places they don't belong." Lisa hesitated, glancing at Margaret's calm face, then back at Karen, unsure how to respond. She felt a tightening in her chest. This wasn't the first time she'd witnessed Karen's cold side, but something about today felt worse. Margaret sat with her hands folded gently in her lap, her back straight and her eyes focused on the window. The sun was dipping lower in the sky now, painting streaks of orange across the clouds. To Margaret, this flight wasn't just another journey. It was part of her weekly routine to oversee operations across her aviation empire, from private charters to commercial routes. But she preferred to travel quietly, without entourage or fuss, observing the service from a passenger's perspective. As Karen continued down the aisle, her smug smile returned while she poured champagne for two executives in tailored gray suits. They chuckled at something she whispered and gave her an approving nod. Margaret overheard one of them say, "Service like this makes these flights worth every dollar." Karen beamed with pride, her back straightening at their praise. Margaret exhaled slowly, a quiet strength resonating within her. She didn't need the world to acknowledge her worth to know it. She carried her dignity like an invisible crown, never needing to announce it aloud. What Karen didn't know, as she basked in the fleeting validation of wealthy passengers, was that her judgmental smirk was about to collapse. Because in a few hours, when Margaret's true identity was revealed, Karen would stand exposed before the entire cabin, her polished facade shattered by the very prejudice she wielded so freely. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, feeling the gentle vibration of the engines through the soles of her polished black flats. The private jet was now taxiing onto the runway, the late afternoon sun casting shimmering reflections across the gold accents lining the cabin walls. The hushed murmur of passengers and the ambient music flowing from hidden speakers created an atmosphere of exclusivity, yet beneath it a silent storm was brewing. Karen Mitchell walked briskly back up the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the plush carpet. She paused beside Margaret's seat once more, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she glanced down. "Excuse me, ma'am Karen," said her voice polite, but with an unmistakable edge. "I think you're in the wrong section. This area is reserved for our elite passengers." Margaret looked up, her dark brown eyes calm and unbothered. "I believe this is my seat," she replied softly, her tone even almost soothing. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her boarding stub, holding it out for Karen to inspect. Karen didn't even glance at the slip of paper. Her lips curled into a tight, dismissive smile as she folded her arms. "I don't need to check," she said sharply, loud enough for the older couple across the aisle to hear. "I know who belongs here." A ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. The two executives who had laughed with Karen earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Margaret's gaze. Further down the aisle, Lisa Campbell, the junior attendant, watched with wide, anxious eyes, her hands trembling as she pretended to rearrange cocktail napkins. Margaret inhaled slowly, feeling the heat of humiliation spread across her chest. But instead of anger, she felt an iron resolve settle over her shoulders like an invisible cloak. She tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "Perhaps you should double-check before making assumptions." Karen's smile faltered for a split second, irritation flashing across her eyes. She leaned in closer, her perfume sharp and floral. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," she hissed, "I will call security right now." Margaret blinked once, then slowly leaned back against her leather headrest, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Her voice remained steady, carrying a quiet authority that silenced even the whispers of passengers nearby. "Call whoever you need to," she replied calmly. "I'm not moving." The businessman, sitting a row ahead, turned slightly, his frown deepening as he observed Karen's growing frustration. Beside him, his wife, a socialite with perfectly coiffed silver hair, clutched her pearls and whispered to him, "She's probably sneaking in for a free upgrade." Karen seized on the comment, straightening triumphantly. "Exactly," she announced loudly to the cabin. "This is why we have rules. Some people just don't respect them." Margaret remained silent, her gaze steady and unwavering. For a fleeting moment, Karen felt a sliver of unease crawl up her spine. There was something in Margaret's eyes, a calmness that felt out of place in this moment of public humiliation. But Karen shook it off quickly, her smirk returning as she gestured again toward the back of the plane. "This is your last chance," she said sharply. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply lifted her chin slightly and repeated her voice as soothing as before, "I'm not moving." And in that instant, though, Karen didn't know it yet, the balance of power shifted silently. Because the woman she thought she was humiliating wasn't just another passenger clinging to a seat she hadn't paid for. Margaret Johnson was the very owner of the wings, carrying them through the sky. And Karen's worst mistake was about to unfold before an audience far larger than the cabin she ruled with false grace. Karen's cheeks flushed pink with anger as she glared down at Margaret. Her fingers drummed against her crossed arms, each tap echoing in the tense silence between them. She turned abruptly, gesturing to Lisa Campbell, who stood frozen a few feet away. "Lisa," she snapped, her voice sharp and cutting, "escort this woman to the back." "Now." Lisa swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously between Karen and Margaret. "Ma'am," she whispered, almost pleading. "Maybe we should check the passenger list first." Karen's head whipped around her blonde bob, swaying as her eyes narrowed to slits. "I said now, Lisa," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. Lisa flinched under her supervisor's icy stare, the reprimand cutting deep into her chest. With trembling hands, she stepped forward toward Margaret. Margaret looked up at Lisa, her gaze softening as she caught the young woman's fearful eyes. "Think carefully about what you're doing," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a calm weight that seemed to settle over Lisa like a protective blanket. Lisa hesitated, her fingers curling into fists at her sides, the conflict evident on her face. Karen scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she turned to the watching passengers, their curious faces peeking out from their plush headrests. "She's causing a disturbance," Karen announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We have rules for a reason." Margaret remained silent, her gaze unwavering as she watched Karen's little performance. From across the aisle, the businessman who had been observing the confrontation leaned forward. "Excuse me," he called out, his deep voice slicing through the tension. Karen turned to him sharply, annoyance flickering in her eyes. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Karen forced a tight smile. "Everything is under control, sir. This passenger is simply in the wrong section." The man looked at Margaret, his kind eyes meeting hers. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Margaret nodded softly, her expression calm. "Thank you," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. The businessman glanced back at Karen, his frown deepening. "Doesn't seem like she's causing any problems," he said quietly but loud enough for those around them to hear. Karen's face darkened, the veins in her neck standing out as her anger simmered. "Stay out of this," she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. She turned back to Margaret, her tone dripping with contempt. "Why don't you just admit you're in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto Karen's reddened face. Because she said softly, each word, deliberate and controlled, "am exactly where I belong." For a fleeting second, the plane felt utterly silent, as if the engines themselves were listening. The air around Karen seemed to constrict, the weight of her arrogance pressing down on her chest. But still she refused to back down. And though she didn't realize it, with each cruel word she uttered, she was sealing her own fate, one humiliating moment at a time. Karen clenched her jaw, feeling heat rise up her neck as murmurs spread among the passengers. Determined to regain control, she leaned closer to Margaret, her breath sharp with the scent of stale coffee and cheap floral perfume. "This is your final warning," she whispered harshly, her eyes cold and unblinking. "Either you move to the back, or I'll have you removed from this flight altogether." Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, and began typing with deliberate precision. Karen watched with growing irritation, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Calling your friends for help?" she sneered. Margaret set her phone down gently on the armrest, her expression unreadable as she met Karen's gaze. "No," she replied softly, her voice smooth as warm honey, but carrying an edge of steel. "I'm just letting the right people know what's happening here." For a moment, Karen felt a flicker of unease crawl down her spine, but she quickly pushed it aside, gesturing again for Lisa to act. The junior attendant stood, frozen eyes darting between them, torn between duty and conscience. Karen snapped her fingers sharply. "Lisa, now!" Lisa stepped forward, but before she could speak, Margaret turned her gaze toward her eyes, gentle but unyielding. "Think carefully," Margaret said in a low, calm voice, "about who you choose to stand with today." Lisa's chest tightened with anxiety. Her hands trembled as she reached for the passenger list clipped by the cockpit door. She knew deep down that Margaret was right. Something wasn't adding up. But before she could flip the page, Karen's voice cut through the thick silence like a whip. "What do you think you're doing?" She barked, her eyes wide with fury. I just wanted to check the list." Lisa stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I have it under control." Karen snapped, her face flushing crimson as passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some turned away, pretending to read magazines, while others watched with open curiosity, sensing that this was no ordinary dispute. Just then, the businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, his deep baritone calm but firm. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, looking directly at Karen. "From where I am sitting, it seems like you're the one making a scene here." Karen's head jerked in his direction, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance." He held her gaze steadily, unfazed. "I'm not encouraging anything, just calling it as I see it." A tense hush fell over the cabin. Karen's confidence wavered, her smirk flickering like a dying flame. She turned back to Margaret, her voice trembling with pent-up rage. "You're going to regret this," she hissed under her breath. Margaret leaned back into her seat, her expression composed and serene, her eyes never leaving Karen's. "No," she said quietly, her voice a calm tide against Karen's crashing waves. "You are." And in that moment, though, Karen refused to see it. The power she clung to so tightly had already begun slipping through her fingers, grain by grain, until nothing would remain but her own exposed arrogance. Karen stood stiffly, her breathing ragged with frustration, as she glared down at Margaret. The murmurs from the cabin pressed against her like a rising tide, drowning out the ambient music and the hum of the engines. She straightened her uniform jacket with jerky movements and snapped her fingers at Lisa again. "Bring security," she ordered sharply, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Lisa hesitated, her fingers clutching the passenger list so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She wanted to say something, to tell Karen that this was wrong, but fear rooted her to the floor. Margaret remained silent, her eyes steady on Karen's flushed face. The tension between them crackled like an invisible electric storm, pulling the attention of every passenger. The nosy socialite from earlier leaned toward her husband, whispering with relish, "See, she's trying to sneak a free ride. They should drag her out now." Her husband frowned, but said nothing, turning back to his tablet uncomfortably. Karen smirked, feeling bolstered by the socialite's words. "That's exactly what it looks like," she said, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "Some people think rules don't apply to them." Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she reached for her phone again, scrolling deliberately before setting it down with careful precision on the armrest beside her. She lifted her gaze and spoke softly, her voice calm and unhurried. "You're making a mistake," Karen scoffed, shaking her head as she gestured broadly for Lisa to move. "Well, see about that," she snapped. Lisa took a small step forward, her lips parting as if to protest. But before she could speak, a deep, commanding voice boomed from the front of the cabin. "Miss Mitchell," the pilot said firmly as he emerged from the cockpit. His lined face was pale, and his eyes flickered anxiously from Karen to Margaret. "Step aside immediately." Karen spun around, confusion flashing across her face. "Captain Reynolds, what are you talking about? I'm handling a situation." "That's enough," he interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet force of a man used to giving orders. He turned to the cabin, his eyes landing on Margaret with sudden deference. "Miss Johnson," he said, bowing his head slightly. "We just received a call from management. They've informed us that the owner of this aircraft is on board." A hush fell over the passengers, spreading like ripples in a still pond. The businessman blinked in quiet understanding. The nosy socialite's mouth dropped open, her judgmental words dying on her lips. Karen felt the blood drain from her face as her eyes flicked from the captain to Margaret and back again. "Owner?" she whispered, her voice trembling now, brittle as glass. What do you mean?" Captain Reynolds inhaled deeply, his tone respectful and clear. "This is Miss Margaret Johnson," he said, gesturing toward the woman seated calmly before them. "She owns this plane, and she owns the entire airline." For the first time since boarding, Margaret allowed herself a small, serene smile as she looked up at Karen's stunned, paling face. The woman who thought she held power in her hands had just discovered that the true power had been sitting quietly in seat 1A all along. Karen's knees felt weak beneath her polished black heels as the captain's words sank in like cold water over her chest. The passengers around her sat frozen in stunned silence, their wide eyes flicking between Margaret and Karen like spectators at a courtroom verdict. Margaret remained seated, her posture calm, and dignified, her expression unreadable, as she looked up at Karen with a quiet strength that cut deeper than any shouted reprimand ever could. The pilot cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson, is there anything you'd like us to do?" Margaret exhaled softly, her gaze never leaving Karen's stricken face. "Yes, Captain," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge sharp as a honed blade. "Please ensure that this situation is addressed immediately. Her behavior today has been disgraceful, and it does not reflect the standards I expect of my airline." Karen's lips parted, her mouth dry as sandpaper. "Miss Johnson." "Margaret, I didn't know." She stammered, her words tumbling out in a desperate whisper. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for someone to back her up. But the passengers who had silently supported her arrogance now turned away, their faces filled with disgust or pity. Even the nosy socialite clutched her purse tightly against her chest, avoiding Karen's pleading gaze. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying her with cool detachment. "You didn't know? Because you didn't bother to treat me with the same respect as everyone else," she said evenly. Her words rang through the cabin, each syllable dropping like a gavel against polished oak. "Instead, you made assumptions. You humiliated yourself, and in doing so you humiliated this airline." Tears welled in Karen's eyes as she took a small, stumbling step backward. Her once confident shoulders slumped as the weight of Margaret's words pressed down on her. "Please, please don't fire me," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to—" Margaret raised a hand, silencing her instantly. "Intentions don't erase impact," she replied, her voice low but resonant, carrying a finality that left the entire cabin breathless. "Your employment here is terminated effective immediately." The cabin door opened with a hiss, and 2 uniformed police officers boarded their presence, filling the aisle with silent authority. They stepped forward, one of them nodding respectfully to Margaret before turning to Karen. "Miss Mitchell," the officer said firmly, "you're under arrest for assault." Karen's knees buckled as the handcuffs snapped cold around her wrists. Tears streamed freely down her face now as she sobbed, "Please, Miss Johnson, Margaret. I'm so sorry, don't let them take me." Margaret's gaze never softened. She looked at Karen with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent her life building an empire rooted in dignity, integrity, and strength. "Your apology means nothing without accountability," she said softly. "This is the consequence of your choices." As the officers led Karen down the aisle, passengers watched in solemn silence, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and quiet shame. Margaret exhaled slowly and leaned back into her seat, her gaze turning toward the window, where the setting sun bathed the clouds in soft golden light. She felt no triumph, only resolve. Because for her, this was never about revenge. It was about ensuring that respect, the very currency of true humanity, would never be treated as optional again. As Karen disappeared down the aisle in handcuffs, the cabin remained hushed, the air thick with a solemn understanding. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the quiet hum of the engines beneath her palms. When she opened them, Lisa stood at her side, tears brimming in the young attendant's eyes. "Thank you, Miss Johnson," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief and admiration. Margaret smiled softly, placing a gentle hand on Lisa's arm. "Always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard," she said. "That's how you grow into the person you're meant to be." The passengers, once absorbed in their own worlds, now watched Margaret with a newfound respect, their faces reflecting the lesson of what they had witnessed. For in that quiet cabin flying high above the earth, they had seen that true power isn't about wealth or titles, it's about treating every human being with dignity, no matter their appearance, job, or background. Life teaches us that respect costs nothing, yet its value can transform lives forever. What about you? Have you ever stood up for dignity when others stayed silent? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if this powerful story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true life lessons and cinematic stories that remind us kindness and courage will always lift us higher than pride ever could.